Welcome, everybody, as we celebrate the National Child Day and we come together as a collective of passionate advocates to have a critical conversation on child and youth well-being in Nova Scotia and the formation of a provincial child and youth commission. So grateful to our partners from IWK, from Mental Health and Addictions, as well as Dalhousie University, Healthy Populations Institute, but many, many other partners as well. I am N from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, the professional practice and advocacy consultant, and I am grateful to be with you all today. So what I'm going to do as I prepare to read a land acknowledgement is to invite each of you who are joining us electronically to use the chat to join us in our land acknowledgement. Please introduce yourself and acknowledge the land where you are located. So if you are not familiar with the land, for example, I am in Cape Breton. The correct name for that is Unamagi. And so if you don't know the Indigenous name for the territory where you're joining us from, please use Google and then add it in the chat so that we can all collectively join together. So I am acknowledging that I am speaking from Mi'kma'ki and that the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. So I invite all of us to take a few moments to take a deep breath and to focus on our own gratitude for this land, for the water, for the air, for the trees, for all of the reasons that we have to be grateful for this beautiful land, for the amazingly wise and brave Mi'kmaq leaders and communities who have cared for this land, continue to care for and advocate for it. Let us take this moment to affirm our commitment to joining in the important work of decolonization, which has affected so many across this planet. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude, as well as an expression of the land-based teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. Please think of the lands, territories, and Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us, individually and as a collective body of social workers and as a collective body of advocates, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Walalu. Thank you. And so with that, I want to invite everyone to feel free to continue using the chat to ask questions. And I am going to now invite our speakers to lead us in speaking on how we can collectively begin to have this conversation. So I think we'll need to have our speakers unmute.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Charlene Gagnon. I'm the Manager of Advocacy Research and New Initiatives at YWCA Halifax, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of moderating this group today in honor of National Child Day, which is happening this Sunday, November 20th. So we're all gathering here today and welcoming our virtual audience to really have a critical conversation about a lot of really important work that has been going on across the province of Nova Scotia related to child rights and well-being. We want to come together to try and unify all of this amazing work that has been happening across the province, and of course, see how we might be able to get it on the agenda for the newly formed Child and Youth Commission to help advance these priority recommendations. For those who don't know, the Child and Youth Commission was created as an independent commission that arose from the recommendations of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children Restorative Inquiry. So we feel that it is very important work, and there has been so much happening across the province. We know that child and youth rights is a pressing issue in Nova Scotia, and as we will go through a lot of the presentations today, we will see how so much of that work is interconnected, intersected, and interrelational. So our format today is we are in the fishbowl here at Dalhousie University. We are using a wonderful technology called OWL. We are sitting around a table. We are going to go through, each presenter is going to present some highlights of the research they've worked on. Some of that will be based on lived experiences. Some of it will be initiatives to address child and youth rights. And some is really, hardcore empirical research for all you data nerds out there like myself. So everyone here has been involved in the publication of a report recently within Nova Scotia. So they're going to give the highlights and one priority recommendation. We will be introducing everybody as we go, so we won't have a big round of introductions in the first. And in between presentations, we have an amazing graphic recorder here. His name is James Niche. And in between presentations, we will be showing you some of the graphical capture that James is doing as we're having these conversations. And this will all be sent out to everybody who has participated in the audience today as well. And then we have some questions that we have developed that we're going to answer, and then we're going to open the floor to the audience for any pressing questions that may be coming as the result of our conversation. So we're going to get right into it. And our first panelist is our youth representative, Estelle Alexander. So Estelle is a fourth-year health promotion honors student at Dalhousie University. She has worked on the feedback from the One Chance to Be a Child report supervised by Dr. Sarah Kirk, one of the lead authors on the report. Estelle's honors work uses qualitative research to collect and assess the feedback from children and youth in Nova Scotia based on their thoughts on the One Chance to Be a Child report. And she will speak to the lived experience of young people in the province. Welcome, Estelle, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm so happy and honored to be here. As Charlene mentioned, I'm a fourth-year health promotion student at Dalhousie University, and I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Sarah Kirk to develop my thesis, and I'm excited to share my research and findings with you all for the first time. For those of you who are not familiar with the One Chance to Be a Child, this is a data profile that provides a contemporary and comprehensive snapshot of how children and youth are doing in Nova Scotia. It does this by addressing 6 questions posed by a UNICEF Canada's report, Where We Stand, the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing, which broadly assesses the status of well-being for young people across the country. Over the summer, I spoke with a diverse group of children and youth from across Nova Scotia. The group included young people between 11 and 18 years old and were asked to read a summary of the One Chance report and participate in a focus group. During the focus group, I got to hear feedback and ideas from a very articulate and passionate group of youth who were eager to be heard and to see change happen. Today, I'm here as a youth representative to share with you all the perspectives and messages from some of the children and youth of Nova Scotia. The first question that I asked during my focus group was, what does well-being mean to you? The participants described well-being as follows. It means being safe, being loved, being happy, having the support you need to go further in life, achieve your goals, a sense of belonging, and having the tools and resources you need to feel connected in your environment. Although many participants could conceptualize and understand what well-being meant to them, they also reflected on their own well-being. One participant shared, "How can we possibly achieve our goals, big or small, if we aren't experiencing well-being?" This quote started an active discussion between the participants. Many stated that they don't think that they are experiencing what we define as well-being, and that well-being of others also has a significant and detrimental impact on their well-being. Through our discussion, I asked them questions about the One Chance report, their key takeaways, and what we would like to see from the recommendations. Throughout the discussion, it was apparent that there was one common theme and that they were all passionate about and eager for everyone to hear. Despite their varying ages and diverse backgrounds, they all agreed that if they could tell the government and stakeholders one thing, it would be that they just want to be heard and given a voice regarding their ideas, their well-being, and their one chance to be a child. I wanted to share a few direct quotes that illustrate what young people feel. One said, "The best people to give feedback or accurate information on what it's like is us, not just a bunch of adults who think they know what it's like." Another shared, "It's frustrating because I wish we got a voice more or people could take us more seriously. I'm a person too." A third said, "We are responsible enough to have a job, or if you're 18 to vote, or drive a car, or be on our own, or consent to certain things, or make decisions about what programs we want to apply to universities for. But yet I feel like no one consults us about us." There needs to be some sort of way to access information so kids are not left in the dark about decisions being made about them without them, one finally said. These are just a few of the powerful messages that the participants shared. Even the youngest participants felt that children and youth in Nova Scotia are not being heard or considered in decisions about their life and well-being. This was beautifully expressed by one participant who said that they were used to adults being the loudest voice in the room because they are supposed to know more. Of the 6 recommendations outlined in the One Chance data profile, all participants agreed that the provincial and municipal governments across Nova Scotia need to take explicit action to realize Articles 3 and 12 of the United Nations Convention of Rights of the Child regarding the child's best interests and the child's right to be heard. This can be done by enacting legislation or bylaws that require a child's rights impact assessment to be submitted when considering new legislation, policy, or relevant child-focused programs and services. So the one recommendation I want to emphasize is that the need to establish child and youth panels or advisories within government ministries or departments to provide counsel on decisions that affect young people. In doing this, participants felt that they would finally get a voice and be heard. Many mentioned that they wanted to be consulted about topics regarding child and youth mental health, bullying, different ways of learning, changes to the school curriculum, at-home supports, equitable access to opportunities, and their overall well-being. The health and well-being of children and youth are critical to their overall livelihood. Their vulnerability and sense of helplessness that children experience are caused by their rights, their voices, and their needs not being heard. The hope from the One Chance report is that youth will be given the one chance to be a child and have a positive trajectory into the future. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Estelle. That sets a nice tone, I think, for the rest of the conversation today. Our next panelist is Danny Graham, Chief Engagement Officer at Engage Nova Scotia. Danny Graham has held senior positions in business, law, and government for over 3 decades. For 10 years, he was the chief negotiator on Aboriginal rights for the province of Nova Scotia. He is credited with starting the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program and has worked to advance justice reforms with the United Nations and countries spanning 4 continents. He is currently the Chief Engagement Officer for Engage Nova Scotia, an independent independent nonprofit that is leading the Nova Scotia Quality of Life Initiative with an extensive network of partners from the public, private, academic, and community sectors, provincially, nationally, and internationally. In 2019, almost 13,000 Nova Scotians responded to a 230 question survey administered by Engage Nova Scotia in cooperation with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. With Dalhousie University, they have developed pioneering tools to extract the findings of the survey in real time across demographic and neighborhood profiles. Partners in all three levels of government are considering the findings of the survey and the use of the tools to catalyze new action, inform policy decisions, and shape the narrative about how to build a successful society. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Charlene. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of the findings, and in particular, the tools that you were talking about that we've been fortunate to build with Dalhousie. I want to, with all of the acknowledgements, I just want to recognize the experience and skill of the participants around the table as panelists, and the many names of people who I've seen come online who have tremendous experience from one end of the province to the other. So it's a real honor for us to share some perspectives about what Nova Scotians shared with us, with an asterisk and a note that that survey that we did, we're going to be repeating in 2024. And we hope that it's going to mean a great deal for people as we imagine in more real time the story of Nova Scotians, and in particular Nova Scotia families. So in the time that we have, I'm going to give you a very quick, this is Charlene, you might enjoy this, others might not, because she said she was inclined towards data. I'm going to give you a feel for the findings that exist in the data that has been mined through those almost 13,000 responses and hundreds of questions. And we've, with this tool that, amongst other tools that we've been able to create with Dalhousie, we're able to understand the stories of, in this case, families of children and youth. So for those who are 12 years and younger, and families that are being led by single parents and families being led by dual parents. And then I'm going to do a bit of a trick, if you will, with the information that will be appearing on your screen by adjusting for income afterward and sharing some additional thoughts. So hopefully my screen is being shared and I'm not creating feedback with my sound. Let me just say very quickly that there's lots to share inside of this tool, and you can go to our website at engagenovascotia.ca to learn out more about what might be of interest to explore in a deeper level. We've examined the questions of countless profiles of Nova Scotians, but we find particularly interesting the story of families, children, and youth to be important to our future, and that we have information that's highly relevant. So with the graph that you're seeing, and I apologize for the, don't try to read the material except to note that in the information that's on the screens for all participants, things that are purple and more deeply purple are concerning. And things that are yellow are more of an asset and something that's commendable. And so you'll see quickly in the two columns that I'm showing right here, and I'm going to scroll down to give you a feel for where those purples and concerns show up, and some yellows as well, that the concerns that we should be identifying for families being led by single parents who are predominantly women are significantly different than the experiences of the average dual parent. So the second column here, where it's predominantly white on your screen, shows that the experience of dual parents of children and youth track with the provincial average on the whole, except when it comes to certain things like time adequacy, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And as I scroll through, you'll see that the issues that show up, first of all, in this pink ledger on the left with purples along this line, relate to the really difficult challenges that single parents are having around loneliness and social isolation, sense of belonging, sense of community. A number of the things, Estelle, that you were saying are actually in the voices of the children who you interviewed. And then beyond that, you'll see the many questions that we cover. Trust in others, trust in institutions, a significant issue. So single parents of children and youth are really don't feel like the system's really designed in a way that suits them and meets the needs that they have. And as we go along, you'll see that they access facilities for leisure and culture more often than others. You might be asking yourselves, and I apologize for the speed at which I'm going here, what are the stories around affordability and poverty for these people? And you'll see in the lines that I'm highlighting here on the screens, really significant issues for families being led by single parents. And then I'll finish with this story of time adequacy that, as I said, is a concern for all families, regardless of whether they're dual parents or single parents. And I'm just going to adjust the screen so that you can see that, in fact, when we adjust this story and we see that we have dual parent households with low incomes below $40,000, suddenly you start to see these purples showing up. So the whites continue, but when we adjust for income, dual parent families are having the same kinds of experiences if they have low incomes below $40,000 relative to the provincial average. Now, there are things that we can do with this, and I'll just give you a quick feature on it with this tool. I'm just giving you a quick sense that we can, for people who are saying, I want to know specifically what these issues of loneliness are, we can convert these to stories that give you an actual percentage feel for loneliness and social isolation. And I'll bring it at the final point to, my apologies for the speed of this, but those issues of affordability and poverty, look at what it shows up for us. That this is the story related to, and you'll see at the top, compared to the provincial average, single parent households with children and youth living at home are approximately 262% more likely to report not being able to pay their bills at least once in the last year. And you go through it, it's food, it's shelter, it's transportation, it's consistently excruciating. And we hope that through the partnerships that we're building, that we're better able to tell these stories in a way that's compelling and relevant to all sectors of our society. So for a recommendation that I would have, just to sort of zoom up for a final thought, this, from our perspective, comes back to the importance of a universal, comprehensive Healthy Starts program that begins at a prenatal and continues to follow children, certainly up to the time that they arrive in school, but beyond that as well. As a former youth justice policy person, it's certainly critical that we go beyond even grade primary, but there's so much more to do in that comprehensive framework for those early years, and I hope we get to that.
Thank you, Danny. That is a very impressive data tool, and I can't wait to go and play around with it. Very impressive. Thanks so much. And we'll come back around when we get into some of the questions. So our next panelist, we'd like to welcome Crystal Hill. Crystal is a registered social worker employed by Nova Scotia Legal Aid. As Legal Aid's Indigenous social worker, she works with Legal Aid clients who identify as Indigenous and who are involved in family court matters. She also has a strong background in mental health and has been employed by Canadian Mental Health Association for more than 10 years. Additionally, she is a proud Mi'kmaq woman from Glooscap First Nation. Welcome, Crystal.
Thank you, Charlene. So when Charlene asked me to come here, I thought to myself, I'm not really a researcher, but as I spoke with her at more length, I realized that part of what I do contributes to the research that other people do. So I'm pleased to be here to speak on my job that I do at Legal Aid, which hasn't always been in existence. The Legal Aid Commission of Nova Scotia first hired an Indigenous social worker back before my position started, which was 2018. So I think it was like 4 years before that. And that was a result of a gap in services for Indigenous folks and having support in the family court. In Nova Scotia, there was, as a result of the Donald Marshall inquiry, the funded this position for family court matters, which is why I don't work in criminal matters. I just work in family matters, because the Mi'kmaq Legal Support Network supports folks going through criminal matters. So I work with folks who are clients of legal aid or legal aid certificates who have family court matters before them. And I can walk with them through that process. People are very nervous and anxious about family court, about attending court. And so I can walk with them through that process between court dates that they have. Oftentimes, as the process is increased, the court dates are wider, and there seems to be a gap of often 3 months before they go to court. And in that 3 months, I can encourage the person to follow through with what the court has deemed necessary for that family to be reunited again. I can provide that family with emotional support. I can connect them with Indigenous resources in their community or in a community that maybe they're not connected to. I can be a bridge between the client and the lawyer. Sometimes if the lawyer is meeting with the client, I'm able to participate in that meeting. I would have the same privileges as the lawyers have. So I couldn't be called as a witness for the client, which allows me to be able to be in the room when the client meets with the lawyer. And sometimes the client will just say yes to a lawyer without always understanding everything fully. So I can, following that meeting, have a conversation with the client to ensure they actually understood what the lawyer is recommending and the direction in which the client ought to go in order to be successful in the reunification of their family. I can connect people to resources in the community and provide, sometimes when I go and see clients in their home, I can provide opportunity for them to smudge if that's important to them, provide them with some Indigenous teachings if that's what they're interested in, and talk to them about where to get those resources so they're able to embrace their culture in a more positive way. Oftentimes people have negative connotations attached to their culture, and which has been contributed to them from the broader society. So an effort to encourage people to take pride in their culture and understand more about it and embrace that. So, and mostly to allow the person to not be alone in that process of family court. Family court's very intimidating. People don't understand the difference between voluntary care and taking into care. So, and kinship placements versus foster homes, all of those things I can work with the client so that they understand them better. And every case is unique and different. And I can walk with them through that process to reduce that sense of isolation and lack of understanding. Another thing that I do is I can participate in family group conferencing that may be happening with that family if they're involved with Mi'kmaq Family and Children's Services. And I can participate in conferencing if the lawyer and the agency lawyer is doing a conference to try to resolve any difficulties within the family before going to court. I can participate in anything that the client wants me to participate in. I can be a bridge between the client and the lawyer. So I can let the lawyer know of maybe changes that are occurring so the lawyer is better equipped to service that client. And available to the client whenever they need me to be available. So that's a nutshell in what I can do, but every case is unique and every case looks different in how I would provide that support to the client. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Crystal, and thanks for all your work and helping people navigate these very complex systems. I think folks who work directly with people often see what all of the researchers are talking about, the effects of some of those challenging systems.
Exactly. And I always say, although I don't work in mental health formally, I still work in mental health every single day. Because
Yes.
if you're involved with a family court matter, your mental health is compromised.
So true.
Thank you.
Whew, heavy stuff happening. So our next panelist is Charys Payne, who is a lawyer with experience in the areas of family law and child protection. Charys also worked for the Nova Scotia Department of Justice, where she held the role of manager for special initiatives of victims. As manager special initiatives, Charys was responsible to deliver programs and provide policy advice in the areas of intimate partner violence and family violence and human trafficking, if I remember correctly. Charys is currently on secondment at the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute as a senior justice strategist. In her current role, Charys works to design and develop programs for African Nova Scotians. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. So first, I'd like to say thanks for having me here as a representative of the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. And similar to my colleague here that spoke before me, I also don't have a report to speak to. However, much of the work of the Institute informs the data that has been collected, and research and data drives policy change. That data is important to the Institute and its work and the design of its work moving forward. And this is a very large question, and place to move through in terms of trying to come up with one recommendation, because there are so many crucial areas that impact particularly African Nova Scotian children and youth. Nonetheless, I'll get into trying my best to be concise on a recommendation and also to give some information about the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute and the work that we intend to do. So the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute began operating in July 2021 and is provincially funded, but importantly, community-led. It's an infrastructure developed in response to systemic anti-Black racism faced by African Nova Scotians in the justice system. Despite only coming into fruition in 2021, the Institute is the culmination of generations of work by African Nova Scotian people and communities. In the last decade, organizations like the African Nova Scotian Decade for People of African Descent came together to give vision and life to the Institute by introducing a proposal to create the Institute in 2019. Since the Institute's creation, it has made valuable contributions to Nova Scotia's justice landscape. For instance, the Institute was an intervener in the R.B. Anderson case, a Nova Scotia Court of Appeal decision that affirmed the use of impact of race and cultural assessments as a valuable tool when sentencing people of African descent, and provided a framework for applying systemic and background factors related to race and culture. The Institute are leaders in this area and currently working on standardizing training for all eligible IRCA assessors. IRCAs are the impact of race and culture assessments. The established mandate of the Institute is to address issues of systemic racism in the criminal justice system that negatively impact African Nova Scotians while ensuring fair legal and constitutional treatment of all African Nova Scotian community members. Since July of 2021, the Institute has been working to hire a team of core senior staff to work on furthering the following, of which I am one of those staff. One, to create programs and services that adequately address institutional racism faced by African Nova Scotians and their families when dealing with human rights complaints, the justice system, all forms of law enforcement and incarceration. The Institute will be a place where African Nova Scotians can turn when seeking legal advice, guidance, advocacy, and advocacy that understands the African Nova Scotian experience as a distinct people. Thirdly, working towards government, non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, and community groups looking to the Institute as a leader in legal research, advocacy, and education on justice issues affecting African Nova Scotian communities. Much of the work of the Institute is intended to provide and address systemic harms perpetrated against African Nova Scotian children and youth, such as the school to prison pipeline, which typically means that young people of African descent are over-penalized in school, undereducated, and how that contributes to overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. There's also overrepresentation in care systems and how that correlates as well. So turning to a priority recommendation. That priority recommendation is that the powers, education, advocacy, and overall advocacy strategies of, for instance, a Child and Youth Commission be robust enough to mandate structural requirements like the collection of race-based data as it relates to overrepresentation of youth in social and criminal justice systems, the development of culturally competent practice standards for staff working with African Nova Scotian youth, that the proposed legislation include a provision recognizing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent. This provision should require the Commission to be responsible to educate and advocate for the interests and needs of children of African descent, and mirrors Prince Edward Island's Child and Youth Advocate Act at Section 12, Section 12, Sub 1, Sub 3, Sub C. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next we're going to actually play a video. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. This video is coming from Lynn Brogan, who was unable to join us in the fishbowl, but has recorded her participation. Lynn Brogan is the president of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, with over 30 years of experience in the human services field, working in several sectors, including persons with disabilities, employment and income assistance, housing, mental health and child welfare. Lynn has held several executive positions within government, including the executive director of the Disabled Persons Commission, the regional administrator of community services, and acting deputy minister. Lynn has won several awards for her leadership and organizational performance excellence, and has a passion for leading transformative systemic change initiatives focused on improving the quality of life for Nova Scotians. Lynn is especially proud of her leadership role in the work that led to the passing of the groundbreaking and historic accessibility legislation in Nova Scotia, as well as her advocacy for social workers dedicated to child welfare reform.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It is a privilege to be able to speak to you on this very important World Day of the Child event. Thank you so much for participating. I thought today would be especially relevant to provide you with an overview of the findings of the organization the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers contracted with beginning in December of 2021, Wisdom to Action. Wisdom to Action is a social enterprise and consulting firm focused on facilitating positive change and strengthening communities. Wisdom to Action prepared their findings after consulting with a wide range of stakeholders with and/or on behalf of families and children in the province. The goal of the project was to gain insight into how the child welfare system could be better designed to address the needs and rights of children in the province, and thereby answer two guiding questions. One, what would it take for every child in Nova Scotia to live in a home and a community free of poverty, violence, and harm that allowed them to reach their full potential? And what would it take to create a child protection system that embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child, as well as the calls?
Sorry, someone is speaking, and I'm just trying to figure out who it is so that we can, okay. I will continue playing. Sorry, we're here we go. Okay.
From the Black and Indigenous Nova Scotians for Reform, as enshrined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and in the inquiry into the Home for Colored Children. In order to reflect the perspective of young people with past lived experience in the child welfare system in Nova Scotia, Y2A created a youth advisory council, and together with the YAC members, Y2A designed stakeholder engagement tools such as surveys, such as focus group, and analyzed the findings of the consultation process. As well, a literature review was conducted which provided insight into historic and pervasive issues within the Nova Scotia child welfare system. Focus groups were conducted with service providers in April of 2022, with one specifically for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Notes were taken during the focus group and subsequently analyzed for emerging themes. The findings from the consultation process will be more clearly articulated in the college's forthcoming policy paper, but we can confirm that findings reflect what is well known by those working and living within the child welfare system in Nova Scotia. And some of these key findings I want to share with you today include: there is evidence of systemic racism, discrimination, and bias throughout the child welfare system. Issues of poverty and housing are intertwined with child welfare systems, impacting the need for intervention and undermining positive outcomes for reunification, safety, and well-being. The current state of child welfare system in Nova Scotia is characterized as being bureaucratic and rule-based, fragmented, complex to navigate, deficit-based, stigmatizing, compartmentalized, and disconnected, liability-driven, closed and shy of self-reflection and criticism, with a long history of poor outcomes for those the system is intended to serve. The amendments made, the 2017 Children and Family Services Act, resulted in unintended negative consequences for Nova Scotians at-risk population, leading to more intrusive investigations and over-surveillance of Black and Indigenous families, creating greater inequity and inequality.
All right, we are going to go back to our panelists, but first we're going to show right here a little bit about what has been there, and then I'm going to have Sarah, our panelist down there, if you can unmute.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, from afar. Our next panelist is Dr. Jacqueline or Jacquie Gahagan, a full professor and associate vice president of research at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Prior to joining MSVU, Jacquie was a full professor of health promotion in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University. Jacquie's long-standing program of health promotion research focuses on evaluating policy and programming interventions using sex and gender-based analyses to identify and address health inequities among equity-deserving populations. Recently, Jacquie and her research team is embarking on new research studies to examine and evaluate the impacts of the tuition waiver programs for access to post-secondary education among former youth in care.
I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for making this important event possible and for inviting me to speak today about the work we're doing in reducing barriers to post-secondary education among former youth in care. As we know, education is a key determinant of health. In fact, education can serve as a buffer against various social, economic, and health challenges Canadians face across the life course. As we know, the youth in the welfare system have lower educational attainment and outcomes than those who don't have experience in the child welfare system. In fact, less than 50% of former youth in care complete high school, and even fewer complete post-secondary education. This issue matters, and that Canada is a signatory on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, noting that SDG number 4 states that, and I quote, "Education must be inclusive, equitable, and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all," end quote. However, when we look at the reality of former youth in care not completing high school and the subsequent barriers in access to post-secondary education for this population, we need to focus our collective understanding on the direct implications this has for underemployment and unemployment rates for this segment of the Canadian population. It's also important to note that Black, Indigenous, and 2S LGBTQ youth are well overrepresented in the child welfare system and remain wildly underrepresented in post-secondary educational settings as students, and as a result, as administrators and decision makers in these settings. The disconnect between the SDGs and other key national and international initiatives the Government of Canada has signed onto cannot be overlooked when we consider the implications of our inaction in reducing barriers to post-secondary education for former youth in care. Not only does our inaction have very obvious implications for economic well-being of former youth in care, but also health, social, and other implications. We need to address the lack of national data comparability. We've talked about data here already, from provinces and territories to fully understand how these existing initiatives, policies, and programs are actually improving the life chances of former youth in care. To put it bluntly, we have done a wholly inadequate job of evaluating if, how, and why certain government-funded initiatives aimed at youth in care are in fact addressing issues such as educational attainment, employment, civic engagement, social mobility, health outcomes, etc. Given the lack of systematically gathered data on the barriers to education facing former youth in care, our research team is currently working on a utilization-focused evaluation of existing tuition waiver programs that are being currently offered across the 4 Atlantic provinces. The overarching purpose of our SSHRC-funded tuition waiver research is actually to understand how tuition waiver programs in this region are impacting the lives of former youth in care who are in these programs, and to evaluate these programs both from the perspective of the youth themselves as well as from the post-secondary institutions that offer them. This 3-year study includes a scoping review of Canada and other OECD countries to understand the art of the possible in addressing barriers to post-secondary education among former youth in care. We're not only looking at issues of financial barriers to education, but also the core elements that are needed to provide wraparound supports and services, such as counseling, peer support, food security, housing, transportation, among others. And it's important to note that many former youth in care may have experienced a variety of intersecting forms of disadvantage, trauma, neglect, and abuse. Simply offering, quote unquote, free tuition is not sufficient to ensure educational attainment. Our team is interested in understanding how the various elements of tuition waivers, which as you can appreciate differ from post-secondary institution, by geography, etc. And we need to work together to provide positive educational experiences for these populations. In terms of key messages, simply put, our provincial government in collaboration with post-secondary institutions should direct more funding toward reducing barriers to post-secondary education among those who have experience in the child welfare system to help address disparities in educational attainment, and to evaluate these at the national level with a shared set of minimum standards in place. To not take action on reducing barriers to post-secondary education among former youth in care, we all as a society pay the cost for our inaction. These costs are not only financial, they're also social and health related, and they do have lifelong consequences. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Jackie. I think we need a lot more evaluation of some investments going on. It's great. So our next panelist is Malcolm Shookner. He is the Atlantic Summer Institute president. Malcolm has an extensive background in community development, social research, health promotion, and public policy in the nonprofit, academic, and public sectors. Malcolm is leading ASI's work on its policy brief to support upstream investment in infant, child, and youth mental health promotion. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thank you. Somebody's going to show my slides, hopefully.
Yes, they are coming.
Okay. I'm going to start with slide 2. The Atlantic Summer Institute on Healthy and Safe Communities is a nonprofit organization founded in 2003, governed by a regional board of directors with participation from the 4 Atlantic provinces. And as part of our mandate as a social a catalyst for social change in Atlantic Canada, focusing on the determinants of health. And since 2015, we have annual summer events, hence the original name, Summer Institute, with things going on throughout the year as funding provides. Since 2015, we have been focusing on child and youth mental health. When researchers from around the region came to us and said, we've been doing interesting work on things like social and emotional learning. We've got evidence to present. We need a platform to present it. Next slide, please. So in 2015, we started to focus on child and youth mental health promotion. And for the next 2 or 3 years, we provided that platform for researchers to come forward to tell us the latest evidence they had found related to this topic. And what it led us to was a couple of important overriding themes. That it takes a whole of government approach in terms of intersectoral action across departments to address these issues. It takes a whole of society approach, again, intersectorally, public, private, nonprofit, academic. And it takes a whole of community approach on the ground to support communities and families. By 2017, we heard lots of evidence and that was calling for action. So for the next 2 years, we developed a call for action, which is on our website, which covers policies, programs, practices, research, and networks, things that can be done, sometimes individually, sometimes by organizations, to advance child and youth health promotion. By 2020, people were saying, we need policy. And so we were urged by participants to develop a policy brief. And so what we did was we convened a working group of people from across the country and across the region to review all the evidence and to identify policy priorities. Next slide, please. Now we're focusing on upstream, which is getting us out of the mental health system, which is like a black hole. You use those words, you get sucked into the challenges of the mental health system, which have been documented around this table. We're trying to focus on mental health promotion, which aims to enable people and communities to optimize their well-being by influencing multiple determinants of health. An upstream focus works to equitably improve the mental health of the entire population and to reduce the likelihood of mental deterioration through the life course. Now, this language comes from a brochure that we developed called Mental Health is More Than You Can, what does it say? Mental health is more than you can imagine. And it provides language from various research projects that talks about what does it mean whole of government? What does it mean whole of society? What does it mean when you talk about intersectoral action, et cetera? So, and what does it mean when you talk about upstream thinking? So that's where that language comes from. We've got lots of these. I'd be happy to send them to people upon request. 4 policy areas in our policy brief. Number 1, mental health in all policies should be the policy framework, building on the health in all policies framework that's been implemented in various jurisdictions in Canada, where all sectors and departments within the government are responsible for building policy to foster well-being and mental health equity. The second policy priority, in the next slide, is a multi-stakeholder forum needed to engage governments, the private sector, civil society, and communities that can accelerate upstream investment and focus priorities. The next slide, the priority area, a whole of community approach. We need to invest in community action. Community groups and organizations are already doing the work to create supportive environments for their children and youth and families. And we need to ensure that these communities have the support necessary to do this vital work. which leads to the fourth priority area, sustained and integrated funding, a chronic problem. We need a cross-sectoral child and youth mental health fund that has core multi-year foundational funding, a rigorous approach to innovation and evaluation, and that is outcome-based. Next slide. Our policy brief, the full brief with all the evidence is available at the first link. We have an executive summary of the policy areas, everything that led up to it. And we also got an infographic, looks like this. That's on in the third link, which is a two-pager easily. And so you can get those electronically. Last slide. So this is our recommendation to the Nova Scotia Child and Youth Advocates Office. Focus upstream on the social determinants of health that support infant, child, and youth mental health, building on the extensive evidence that's been compiled and reported by organizations represented here.
Thank you, Malcolm. All of my favorite things being talked about: upstream work, evidence, data, evaluation. And now our last, but certainly not least panelist, Lila Pavey. Lila is a health promotion specialist with the Mental Health and Addictions team at IWK Health Center. Lila holds a master's in public health from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from St. Francis Xavier University. Lila's current role at IWK Health encompasses a population health approach striving for improving protective factors for positive mental health and well-being, and reducing risk factors and inequities for children and youth in Nova Scotia. Lila is from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and is a contributing author on the report Hearing Them: Exploring Vulnerabilities and Risk Factors for the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children and Youth in Nova Scotia. Welcome, Lila.
I guess I'll just jump right in. Nova Scotia currently has the highest provincial rate of police-reported human trafficking in Canada, and one of the highest provincial rates of trafficking of victims ages 12 to 17. We need to be asking the question, why? The Hearing Them paper series is an attempt to answer that question and look at what is making people vulnerable and what are the specific risks. In 2021, YWCA Halifax, the Association of Black Social Workers, and the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association partnered to undertake the Hearing Them consultations. 149 adults with past and previous or present lived experience in the sex industry were recruited from partnering agencies in the Trafficking Exploitation Support System, also known as TESS. Our report couples participants' self-identified risk factors at the time of their first involvement in the sex industry with literature on risks and overlays that with statistical data for those specific risks for children and youth in our province. It's important to note that the sex industry operates on a continuum, and our concern is specific to those who've been trafficked and the commercial sexual exploitation of children and youth. As we know, these experiences can have harmful, lifelong implications that contribute to poor health outcomes. 31% of our Hearing Them participants met the definition for commercial sexual exploitation at the time they first became involved in the sex industry. What we know from the literature, involvement in the sex industry can be driven by a variety of needs: immediate survival needs, such as access to food, secure housing, basic income, being safe, secure, supported for emotional connection, attachment, for lots about sense of belonging. When children and youth's needs are not able to be met within their existing living circumstances, there's an increased vulnerability for poor health outcomes. And children and youth's needs not being met in Nova Scotia is the crux of why we are here today. The global literature on CSEC indicates factors such as living in poverty, physical, sexual, emotional, child abuse, substance use, witnessing violence, etc. That's what creates the risk. These factors are inclusive factors that we sometimes refer to as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. In order to effect change, we need to improve the conditions that surround children, youth, and families. What we heard from the lived experience was only 1 out of those 149 participants identified that they didn't know what the risk factors were that played into their first involvement in the sex industry, strongly suggesting that individuals are incredibly aware of the risks that lead to their involvement, meaning educating children and programs are extremely valuable, but they won't solve our problems with CSEC in Nova Scotia. We need to go deeper and impact those conditions. Economic risk, unstable family dynamic, substance use were the top 3 self-perceived risk factors at the time of first involvement. The effort to meet those material needs to live is a major driver to the sex industry. Again, when these basic necessities are not met, children and youth are more vulnerable to being exploited for means of survival. Many participants also identified that they traded sexual services for things besides money. The most common non-monetary things traded for were substances, rent, a place to stay, and then followed by food. Given today's current housing, food, and economic crisis, the climate for continued and growing exploitation is dangerously high. The stories shared in the Hearing Them further validated the literature on the impact of sexual abuse, witnessing violence as a child, as well as other key findings related to significantly high rates of involvement with child protection and youth justice systems, which we've heard. More exploration of that relationship is needed, and unsurprisingly, there was overrepresentation of our participants who are African, Nova Scotian, or Indigenous within those systems. Other areas emerging from the data were the fundamental need to belong, the impact and role of substance use, and the need for protected online space and understanding how organized crime networks operate in Nova Scotia. Vulnerability for CSEC needs to be analyzed from the context of surroundings, not on an individual basis, but to be analyzed from the context of the surroundings in which we live. When we look at that context for Nova Scotia, the province is underperforming on several important health and well-being indicators compared to the rest of Canada. When we unpacked those statistics on the risk factors, such as household poverty, food insecurity, child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, youth substance use, bullying, all of those rates are higher in Nova Scotia than the rest of the country. So it's not surprising that this is the situation we find ourselves in. This is what's increasing the vulnerability for children and youth in this province to experiencing and becoming sexually exploited. The good news is these are conditions and environments that are created, and we can change those. Our report outlines 6 key recommendations, and given that these risk factors for CSEC are also health and well-being indicators, we strongly feel that each one of these needs to be driven through a comprehensive whole of government approach. One place to start is really establishing an integrated plan with shared outcomes for Nova Scotia to ensure children and youth's rights are at the forefront of all decision-making tables. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila. Okay, we're just going to pause for a minute and just kind of digest all of the really important information that has been discussed here today. And we're going to focus in on some critical questions that have been developed with the input of all panelists and organizers ahead of time. So we're going to have about an hour for discussion. And we're going to start off with the 3 questions we've come up with, and then we're going to hand it over to the audience participating online to ask any questions they would like, either to the whole of the panel or one particular presenter. So question 1, we're going to kind of just get us, I'd like to hear folks' reflections on some of the stuff that has been discussed today. Any key takeaways, or, I mean, it seems pretty clear that we have some shared goals around the table. So any reflections on that? So Crystal, I'm wondering if you want to start us off with some reflections on what you've heard today.
Thank you, Charlene. One of the things that seems to be among everybody's discussions here today so far is really the sense of the youth having a sense of belonging and participating and feeling like there's something there for them and that their voice is being heard. The other thing that I thought, although only one person said it, but it's underlying in everyone else's is having mental health at the top of all policies for consideration. Because when we talk about the sex trade, when we talk about bullying, when we talk about education, all of that is to do with mental health. If people don't feel they're able to have other choices, then they take the path of least resistance, so to speak. So those two things coming out. Poverty is a big thing that was identified. So having a guaranteed income for every single Nova Scotian family can make a huge difference in all families, whether they're involved in excuse me, whether they're involved in child protection cases like I would be involved with, or just the working poor in the province. There's people in dual parent households that are struggling just as well as single parent households. So the evidence is out there. So a guaranteed income for all Nova Scotians could be a change maker for all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
Thanks. That belongingness theme definitely struck me too. And the word loneliness came up quite a bit, I found, throughout the presentations. Yeah. Lila, do you have any thoughts on reflections?
Yeah, I had the privilege of going last and kind of absorbing everyone's conversations as we were getting going. And again, like the themes keep emerging of the sense of belonging, loneliness, poverty, affordability, mental health. It also struck me as kind of our overrepresentation in systems, and then those same populations being underrepresented in other systems. But I think what's sitting with me is the fact that through all of this, we all came to this table representing a different angle or a different group or a different organization or institution, and yet we're all talking about the same things. And we have the data. We have Engage Nova Scotia's brilliant toolkit that we can look to. We have the One Chance report that has collected and brought everything together for us. Now it's, what do we do with this information? And we are all sitting here from different organizations coming together on this day to say, this is what needs to be done. These are the issues that are identified. This is the impact that that's having. They're all boiling down to these core human needs. And now what do we do with that? And so really, I think making sure that we continue to push forward some of these tools where these indicators all come and sit together, and we reflect on those as a province continuously over and over and over again until we get it right, until those numbers start coming down and we start seeing communities thrive.
Yeah, I think someone said before we started, it's like we're all coming together today with this opportunity, and now this, with the formation of this Child and Youth Commission, like what better vehicle in order to try and move forward on some of these things. Before we move on, yeah, go ahead, Malcolm.
My reflection, I didn't say I'd do
No,
this.
no, you're good.
Starting with the first voices, through with the experience of the Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities, the incredible research and the quality of life the Engage Nova Scotia has done, and all the other things we've heard, as you've said. It all starts with the Rights of Children and Youth, which is an international convention, which is also based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you have the social sustainable development goals, which reflect all of those rights. And also what we've come to know as the social determinants of health, which are embedded in all of those human rights charters. And our governments have obligations under those charters to take action, and that action has not been taken. The evidence is appalling of how bad things are in many ways. So with the formation of this Child and Youth Advocate Office, we have an opportunity to provide a focal point and a springboard. If they agree to work with all of us, which begs the question, which we'll come back to. Number 3 is how do we all work together? But the evidence is clear and it's grounded in human rights.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty clear. Even though, you know, I'm all for more research. Sometimes it's like, oh, when we hear we need more research, it's like, actually, we have a lot of research. Let's start doing something with what we have
Exactly.
right now. Okay, anyone else? Reflections? Okay, we'll move on to the next question. So I'm going to start with you, Danny. What do you think are key things that decision makers need to know or do to support the well-being of children and youth in Nova Scotia?
Well, there's a lot that we all need to know because what I think part of what we understand from the presentations today, the research and the studies, that there's no silver bullets, and I would argue that there's no single villains in all of this. That the responsibility for bringing this together rests with all of us in a sort of imagining what the goal of a good and healthy society is, and having conversations about that cuts across more sectors than it often is. And too often we find ourselves in the conversations about health and wellness that has one sector of the community sector and some public people involved, but not fully engaging the private sector, for example. And we're all members of a single society. And I think from our perspective at Engage, it really comes back to asking and grounding our conversations in what a successful society looks like. And our aspiration is to change the way that we improve quality of life for everyone. And if we're going to do that, we need to begin first with better questions. And when we begin to imagine solutions, it's hard to imagine that we don't begin at the earliest stages of imagining a welcoming start for young people, that when they arrive as infants, for example, in Nova Scotia, they know that we are organized around frameworks and systems and even legislation and priorities that is about the well-being of their generation, and not just what the pressing and immediate issues are at this time. And there's always balance to be struck. But I've been around social policy for a long period of time, and the frustration that I frankly have is that so many of the solutions that we're imagining are reactive and not sufficiently. I know we talked about upstream, but they're even from my perspective at the most fundamental level, bringing us together, all of us together, in all sectors together in this conversation. And an anecdote related to this relates to something that I was hoping would get more attention than it did, but I was part of after the IWK Commission report that many people would know created a lot of buzz in Nova Scotia starting back in 2014. A collection of 12 Nova Scotians were brought together to talk about, okay, how do we follow that up actually to begin to imagine a new way? I was fortunate with others to be part of that group. And the first chapter that we wrote for what was expected to be a business report about economic development was about the early years. And I think if we went back to what the collection of business, academic, government, and other leaders were saying about the importance of the early years in the many conversations that we'll have, then we'll begin to sort of say, oh, yeah, right. The questions need to be grounded over the long term in core issues around what does success generally look like, so that we don't go to the proxy that the economy looks good, so we assume that things are going well for everyone, and of course they're not. So if we can just begin asking those richer, create space like you have today for the richer conversations, I think it will, it's not just for government, it's for all of us to be fostering those conversations together and inviting people who aren't at all of these conversations to be more part of it.
I haven't thought of the IWK report for many years, Danny. But it's true. And I mean, this is how many years ago was that?
Yeah, 2014 was when I think it was launched. And then the second report, it was the second report that I'm pointing to. Everybody's been focused on these 19 goals, which are fine. They create a nice dashboard and that sort of thing. I think the richer work was done in the 7-chapter work that spoke about, you know, if your only goal is a strong and vibrant economy over a period of time, you're not going to get it unless you do a better job with on early years and having a more welcoming society. So if that cross sector of folks have arrived at that conclusion, let's make sure we don't lose the whatever wind was in the sails, or bring that wind up a little bit to make sure that we're all imagining it differently.
Estelle, our youth representative here, what do you think about key things that can be done either from decision makers or community, or anything that will support the well-being of children?
Yeah, I mean, I was completely blown away hearing everyone's different experiences, the work that everyone has done, and especially hearing children and youth's perspectives and seeing how, although every single one of us has had different experiences or different research focuses or work focuses, they all have one common goal, and it's obviously children and youth. And a lot of what we talked about today was stuff that the children and youth in my focus group had reiterated. And it's all stuff that they are aware of that's happening, and stuff that they want to be heard more about, whether it be youth mental health or legal services or schools, or, you know, just community-based things. So I would say for the, just based on the experiences here and the, you know, the experiences that youth and children of Nova Scotia have told me about their growing up, their childhood, what they want to see happen. You know, I had a few participants say that we're not as naive as people think. I have ideas. I want to be heard. I don't want to feel like I'm dumb or I'm stupid, because I have a voice and it needs to be heard. And I want to see change happen, especially when it comes to my own life, and people should not be making decisions without consulting me on that. So I think that's a, you know, clear message that needs to, you know, a main takeaway of it all. And children want to be involved in this discussion. And even some of my younger participants, they were fully aware of the reality of Nova Scotia's situation. So we just need to better support our children and the youth of Nova Scotia and be there for them through all of these different, you know, support services and the work that we're doing. So I would definitely say that, you know, one key focus, just to reiterate what I talked about earlier, is just making sure that children and youth are being heard, and that we are giving them the tools and resources for them to be able to speak and, you know, give their opinions and, you know, advise them. And whether that be, a few of them suggested, you know, we're in school 5 days a week. Let's do something within schools. Let's do something in our communities, you know, get us a little bit more involved. We're here and we want to talk, and, you know, we just haven't been provided the platform for that yet.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting that we're talking about child and youth, and we have, like, the education system hasn't come up a whole lot in our conversations, with the exception of post-secondary, access to post-secondary education. But yeah, is it nothing about us without us? Maybe taking on a bit more of that approach. Charys, did you have key points that you were thinking of?
I do have some thoughts just based off of everything I've heard today. It's such a rich discussion, but when we're thinking about what we're speaking about, we're talking about conditions, right? And we're talking about conditions that are symptomatic of trauma, right? And I can imagine only, you know, generations before us of people not sitting in front of an owl or, you know, doing a virtual fishbowl this way, but talking about these very issues. And so that denotes intergenerational and historic and structural issues. And while there's no one villain, right, our government, right, is supposed to hear the needs of constituencies, which I'm sure, you know, from an African Nova Scotian perspective, they've been voiced for many years, and from all the groups around the table, right? And so when we're thinking about that, we have to think about who are our most vulnerable. And if we can respond to the needs of our most vulnerable, then we have a chance for raising the tide for everyone in Nova Scotia. And I can't stop thinking about the Child and Youth Commission and, you know, the restorative inquiry, right, and the recommendations that have flowed from that. And what we're talking about is how do we transform those conditions? We don't simply want to restore ourselves to a state that never worked,
Yeah.
but we want to be transformative, and we definitely don't want to be performative, right? And so that's what the government, I think government needs to know and needs to hear, right? And how do we not be performative? How do we be transformative? It is including first voice, as we've discussed. It is looking to agencies like the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute and their expertise when it comes to the lived experience, policy understandings, right? And legal understandings of the experiences of African Nova Scotians, and at the forefront of considering policy and law, inviting us to the table. And that goes for all, public interest groups that sit here today. And so that's the biggest thing that I would put forward to government decision makers is we have the expertise. Please listen and infuse that in the policy. That's what's really going to make that transformative change that we're all so desperately seeking. My comments.
Love it. Yeah, love that. And I mean, if you think about when we're talking about human rights and, how we, even our children and youth have a right to representation within our government, within our systems, every single one of us. That is the fundamental human rights, to be represented by our government. And what happens when we're not, when certain segments of the population aren't being represented by our government? I think you're absolutely right. I don't want to go back to the way things were. Let's transform this. I almost swore there, Jacquie. Okay, so last question before we turn it over to our audience. Question 3 kind of builds on some of the stuff we've been talking about in terms of how can we work together? How can we've heard all of these reports have a lot of different recommendations in them. How do we prioritize those recommendations? How do we advance them? And how do we really get in there with the Child and Youth Commission? And Malcolm, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Great to have that opportunity. Building on what was been said before, we've talked in our policy brief about a whole government approach, and we're suggesting that mental health and all policies is a framework for government to get its act together, and perhaps the Child and Youth Commission could be the catalyst for that to happen in government. And then Danny referred in his remarks to all of us. We all have responsibility here. The whole society approach, again, is something that emerged from the research we reviewed. We're all in this together. We all have responsibility to do the best we can for our children and youth. We're proposing a multi-sectoral forum would be, as our third priority area, would be a gathering place, as Danny was suggesting. We can all come together and continue this conversation. I don't know about you, but I got a lot more to say, and I'd like to hear a lot more. So I think we need to make a bigger table, invite more people in, and invite government in and have the conversation, because they need to be part of this as well. So I think those are ways that and the Atlantic Summer Institute, which is a multi-stakeholder forum for the whole region of the 4 provinces, would be eager to work with Nova Scotia organizations like Engage and others. Engage is a multi-stakeholder platform. Maybe we build on your work in partnership with all of us in whatever ways we can contribute to advance the policy recommendations, which we seem to have a lot of consensus on, and to engage with government around policies that will work for our infants, children, and youth.
I love that. I've been working, in community for a long time, and you don't know how many times I've heard the phrase, we need to break down government silos. I cringe when I see a recommendation that talks about breaking down government silos. So I really like the language that's coming out of ASI's work around the whole of government and the whole of community approach. I don't want to hear about breaking down silos anymore. Jacquie.
So I guess I won't be talking about breaking down silos. So what I did want to say is that, and we've all sort of touched on this, but Canada is a signatory on a variety of human rights-based initiatives. So from my perspective, where's the evidence to say we're actually meeting or exceeding those targets? Okay, so I hear you when you all say we don't need more data. I would gently disagree. I think, and what I mean by that is, if there are policies, there are programs, there are other things funded out of our tax dollars, I actually want to know, what is it doing to reach those national and international and provincial mandates? And if we're not collecting and reporting that, then who is actually being held accountable? So I'm sorry to talk a little bit about the silo effect, but
Yeah.
Mental health affects kids. So does access to quality education. Quality education is SDG number 4. So what are we doing about that file, particularly for populations that have worse educational attainment because the systems and structures don't work for them? So unfortunately, if the majority of kids in school kind of squeak by, then that ticks a box saying, I guess we're okay with the education file. I think we need to actually dig deeper and look at how do our international declarations mirror what's actually going on in this country.
Yeah, I think the accountability piece is big. I don't think we have enough accountability. Yeah, please.
So I love the fact that you're here and that you're sharing your research. And I think that for me, the solution rests in the voices of, no pressure, children and youth, to actually say, it's not okay to just follow the status quo and say, we're assuming that people in charge within government and other complex systems have the right answers to complex issues facing children and youth today. So what worked 10 years ago, 20 years ago, may not in fact be responsive to what's going on in society today. So I actually think that part of the rights-based approach means it's the rights of children and youth, and they have to be part of the conversation and foregrounding their voices in the solution.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think that when you talk about assuming that the government has all the right answers, what I see in child protection families that are involved with child protection is those children that were taken from their families and under the care of the province, when they have children, they are then flagged as not good parents. So if the province has raised them from infancy or early childhood, then they haven't done a good job. If they're flagging those then young adults who have children for apprehension or having children that are at risk. So what we've done historically isn't working, specifically is not working for Indigenous families. So that I always wonder why the agencies say, well, as a derogatory statement toward a parent, stating that this young parent was a child in care, and that's to their advantage to take away their children. So that speaks volumes to me, and it should to every other Nova Scotian, that the children that they're taking away are young adults that were part of the system that has definitely failed in the parenting of those children.
I mean, and so much of the work with the CSEC and trafficking stuff, and I do a lot of work in homelessness housing, and you just see it. You see the people who were raised by the systems are the people who become most involved in the systems, criminal justice system, in all of the, in the needing income assistance, like all of those things. And you're absolutely right, is like the government is the ones who are raising these,
But they don't take any responsibility for that.
Yeah.
So
I really appreciate the first voice and more first voice in every way possible. I mean, I've got a personal dream about us imagining legislation where we're grounded by something that Wales has called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's something robust and comprehensive that just sort of starts with everything in the filter, but really begins with imagining what those voices are, and for us to be more inclusive of it. And the responsibility, as my perspective is, sits in many directions, and there are some hopes. I noticed that one of the participants on the line is Lorraine Glendenning, who is working in government right now on a project with DCS, with real first voice related to people who have been in care, leading the conversation and facilitating the conversation about, okay, let's just center, in fact, their leadership and what they have as a possibility to sort of reimagine this in a different way. So there are hopeful shoots that are coming up, but much more of it, I think, needs to happen for us to crack the nut more often.
And I think just one thing I wanted to say on the first voice involvement piece is, like, it's one thing, and I think it came up, one of the panelists talked about it. It's one thing to ask what you think, tell me your stories, give me your data. It's another thing to put folks in leadership positions, and it can't just be about, we consulted, let's check this box. That needs to be meaningful engagement, and it needs to get to decision makers. We need to figure out a way to make a pipeline from first voice to decision makers, and not just have it end in these reports.
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't think enough credit is being given to the One Chance report and what that has done in terms of setting a new standard for how reporting is done in our province, and really taking, because it was immersed in first voice to inform that. Different sections of that report were written by community expertise, like you said, Charys, around kind of getting the people who have the lived experience, who know the issues intimately, to be the ones putting the suggestions forward. And when you talk, Jacquie, about how do we honor those and track our record against those United Nations conventions, this was modeled on that international framework for what should we be looking at, and it's being done from a community-driven or ground-driven response that is creating a shadow report. So we're not getting that performative issue in the One Chance report. We're getting what is happening on the ground, what does this look like, and what are the recommendations. It's now, how do we make sure that if we continue to have these reports, how do we make sure that those go forward in a way that advances those recommendations and reduces those numbers?
Okay, so I think we have some questions coming in. I don't know.
We do,
Cecilia,
yes.
okay,
I'm gonna.
Okay, perfect.
I will try my best. So the first question, there are a lot of questions coming in, is given the Legal Information Society's recent report, Free to Be Me, about formal and informal conversion therapy risks, how does the systemic queer phobia, which is amplified by the rejection of parents, families, and houses of worship, all impact health risks for queer youth? What can we do to raise awareness about this problem? I also got a second question that was sent to me privately related to this same issue, which is, why isn't queer phobia mentioned in these reports explicitly? Why isn't there a specific report just for queer youth when we know that they are, as Lila mentioned, the most highly trafficked amongst the most highly trafficked, was one of the other questions. So 2 questions on that topic.
Great question. Who wants to take that one? Jacquie?
So there is a section in the One Chance to Be a Child report, which I wrote, and it is about 2S LGBTQ issues. And I think, that the terminology queer phobia is not specifically stated in that. I think it speaks to a bigger sort of structural issue around human rights legislation, and this is not new news to anybody, but 2S LGBTQ folks are protected under our human rights framework, but again, the way it is enacted in systems, including healthcare systems and mental health care systems in particular, is not particularly reflective of that. So I think there's more work to be done, but I can say with a great deal of pride that I met with a group of queer folks from the community here in Nova Scotia and met with the minister about the issue of conversion therapy. And there was a lot of conversation by queer community members, not just me, but others around the table, being very fulsome in their frustration about the disconnect between what the province says and what the federal government says around protecting the rights of 2S LGBTQ folks and how that actually manifests itself in systems and services. So I hear you and completely agree that more needs to be done. The conversion therapy, Nova Scotia was actually quite quick off the block with respect to banning conversion therapy. Where it becomes tricky, and I know folks on the line probably know this, is that means people can't charge through MSI, for example, to provide conversion therapy. So that's a win in a sense, but it doesn't prevent other organizations or individuals from doing that horrific practice to particularly young queer folks. So I'm not sure if that fully answers that question, but there is some content in the One Chance to Be a Child report that touches on these kinds of issues.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just add to that for the CSAC hearing them report. The first piece around risk and prevention factors is just one of 5 reports that will be released in this series that we've taken. And so we definitely looked at participant demographics, and out of the 149 participants, we definitely saw an overrepresentation based on our kind of community representation of 2S LGBTQIA community members. And so that is definitely important to talk about and raise issue about. And there's more details in the paper, and then those links will be sent around, but we need to continue to be discussing and bringing those to the table. So thanks for that mention.
Thank you very much. So many more questions coming in. What constitutes youth? We hear a lot of service support gaps for older youth, especially those aging out of care with intersecting issues like homelessness, income assistance, disability, addictions, and mental health. And all of these gaps make them more vulnerable to things like abuse and sexual exploitation. Do we know if the commission will be able to address the needs of older youth / young adults?
Good question.
I can jump in. One of our recommendations from the Hearing Them report really looks at some poverty reduction recommendations pieces. And one of those that continues to be brought up from frontline folks is around the employment support and income assistance line, particularly youth between the ages of 16 to 18 who are facing many barriers in terms of accessing financial support and are kind of locked into a hard place where our systems and supports don't speak to each other. And so if you lean into one support, that can disadvantage you for other government supports. And so one of the things we need to do is figure out how can we succinctly be more human-centered. And that goes back to Lorraine Glendining's work in the Shared Outcomes Framework, is how do we, not just our systems, but our supports, how do they complement each other rather than be punitive for folks? So definitely those recommendations need to be brought forward to the Children and Youth Commission to make sure that youth of all ages are being represented. And so as the commission starts to take hold and develop itself, these are the types of engagements that they want to hear and we want to hear, so that we can continue to advocate for all children on that continuum.
So just to add to that, the question about aging out and what do we mean by youth, I think in terms of youth in the child welfare system, it's important to note that you age out depending where you live at a different random age.
Mm-hmm.
So the suggestion that our team is coming up with is that this should be done to an older age, recognizing that with the current fiscal climate that we're living in, et cetera, if you were living in your parents' basement as an 18-year-old, your parents are not going to come home and change the lock and kick you out.
Mm-hmm.
So if the state is your parent and the current climate is not feasible for you to live independently, whatever that might mean, having an arbitrary cutoff depending on where you live at 18 or 19 years of age absolutely does not take into consideration all of these other factors that if you were in a family of origin, if you will, or some other familial configuration, you would not find yourself homeless, eating out of a garbage can, etc. So I hope the CYC actually looks at how they're defining what youth is and have some standardization across the country, recognizing that this is not okay to essentially say, we're no longer your parent, bon chance doesn't need because you have to do it yourself. That is completely antithetical to the health and well-being of children and youth, full stop. And I'm pretty sure if there was a lawyer in the room, they could dig up some ways that is actually counter to our human rights code. So I think there should be either a significant kind of groundswell about changing the definition and being a little bit more intentional about the health and well-being of those individuals rather than a de facto at this age, off you go.
All right, there are a million questions, so I'm going to try to keep going. This information is undoubtedly critical for the commission to be informed by. I'm wondering what those on the panel are committed to doing to ensure that youth are leaders at the commission, partners and experts in their own experiences, and not just recipients of goodwill or the subject of, now I've lost my question, or the subject of research, essentially ensuring the first voice of children and youth are incorporated in a meaningful way and are supported in access, understanding, and utilizing this crucial data, which is their data, and also integrated into the inquiry, monitoring, and evaluation of the well-being of youth as we move forward. Just a little question amongst the many awesome questions coming in.
Danny, I feel like you're pontificating on that one.
Okay. I was trying to sort of orient myself to the question, except to say that it's a really wonderful and profound one. And at Engage Nova Scotia, we're imagining, we're actually looking to host a variety of conversations around the province and with demographically excluded voices about what the future could look like, and not to whiplash back into doing it the same way that we've always done it. And in the course of our ideation about what do those conversations look like and who needs to be in them, amongst the things that I can't fully promise because we're not etched in stone on this, is to set as a guideline that 50% of the participants in that conversation meet a youth age group, whether it's African Nova Scotian youth, queer youth, people across the regions of Nova Scotia who often are surprised when you even ask them to sort of participate. And I'll just add, part of our motivation for that is that we get at the stories of children and youth through the responses of parents, the stuff that I showed earlier on. But the respondents began at age 16, and we've done a lot of analysis about the turns out excruciating experiences of young adults beginning at age 13 relative to other age groups. And it blows me away on these questions about sense of belonging and sense of community and loneliness and isolation and self-reported mental health, self-reported physical health for young people, poverty issues, just crushing. And so that's informing the choices that we're trying to make sure that that first voice in all of its intended dimensions is part of the work that we're trying to advance. Those 4-6 forums, more to say on that later, are centering those voices.
I feel too, having done a lot of first voice engagement with the sole purpose, not of research, flipping the language from research to consultation and finding ways to bring the information gathered directly to power, right? So again, it's back to creating those channels to power, because I hear what the person who asked the question, it's something that you're always struggling with, right? Like there's ethical considerations in how we engage folks. There are expectations that are set if we're asking people to consult and then nothing happens. And then, for the people who are collecting the information and trying to bring that information to power and to decision makers, we can only bring it. We can't guarantee any kind of change, right? So it's always difficult and challenging when you're in this role of kind of like, the systems person who is responsible for getting that information from the ground up to power. But I do think that with implementing, like coming up with those processes, using a whole community approach and actually engaging lived experience in how we do this in an ethical way that may not be defined yet by academics or by traditional means of consultation. So back to the, transforming some of these systems is actually almost what we have to do first.
Just add.
So
Can I just add one piece to that? We have to also be mindful in our efforts to engage First Voice around this notion of equity tax. So we have populations that are overrepresented, for example, in the child welfare system or in other systems, and they are over asked. And the fatigue and the equity tax, I think, is something that we need to think about. So what I hear from the youth that we engage with is provide adequate reimbursement. Don't pick my brain for free. It's not good enough to invite me to tea and biscuits. You actually have to compensate me if you want to hear what I have to say. So that equity tax piece has to be thought of in terms of those who can physically get there and those who can participate in a meaningful way, expect something, not just reimbursement for their time, but like do something with this. Telling you all of this stuff, do something. So how do we actually have a check and balance in engagement and reciprocal and done in a good way that is respectful of youth and children's time?
So another question that has come up is, rather than reinventing the wheel, since we rate last among the provinces, when we look at areas that are doing better, countries that are doing better, I'm just reading, to see what they are doing that we are not doing. So when we look out at places where people are doing better, what do we see that they're doing that we could maybe adopt?
So we are doing that in our work. We're actually looking at Canada in relation to other OECD countries to see what they're doing in terms of providing adequate supports for youth in care who want to pursue post-secondary education. It's a concrete, hived-off piece of that comparative analysis, but it does allow for us to look at the art of the possible in other OECD countries and bring those innovative ways of addressing aging out. You don't qualify for educational supports, you haven't finished high school and nobody's paying attention to that. Actually looking at how other countries do this and bringing that back to decision makers and say, see, it actually is possible, because here's half a dozen examples of how it's being done elsewhere in other OECD contexts. So I think, Nova Scotia has won the race of being last, which we need to actually think about not just how is this happening elsewhere in Canada, but look outside of Canada, because I think far too often we do a little bit of happy navel gazing and assume things aren't that bad, and eventually Nova Scotia will catch up. We have huge problems in Nova Scotia across the board, and I'm sorry to say it this way, but children and youth in Nova Scotia are inheriting all of that, let's just say, for policy decisions that have been made, that they now have inherited that. And if we think of this from an Indigenous perspective, the decisions that you make today have generational effects that go on and on and on. So we need to find an appropriate way to interrupt that, that inheritance, if you will, of poor policy and programming decisions.
Can I just build on that for a moment, and on it's a sobering reality when you look at, well, first of all, often Canada does well on a variety of social measurements relative to other OECD countries and related issues. But when you take a look specifically at the children and youth questions for Canada, actually they're quite discouraging. So as a country, generally, we haven't done well. Just so the benchmark of the national average is a concern. So there is something in the imagining what's working well from other countries. It's not hard to find them, not hard to imagine what those policies are. No need today to get into them, but there's a lot of good things that are happening that sort of begin in those early years more effectively. And so together, Yeah, those start with more fundamental questions, and so together, safety net, if you will, that's more robust than what we've been able to.
That would be a great topic for another conversation with a broader table, including government. What's working well in other places that we can apply here to address these big problems we have? It would be a great topic of conversation. We can bring in what people have learned, talk about it, and have the young people participate in those discussions. They have their own ideas, and that's a positive way to move forward in terms of proposing solutions to some of these things.
Awesome. Well, we have, sorry.
I was going to go so far to say that we need to look not just Canada example or OECD countries, but what are communities doing that are connecting and human-centered and supportive? We have an Indigenous community all around this country, different communities that have come together with traditions and histories of being communal. And how do we bring that sense of belonging and break down loneliness at the beginning by looking at where are other places being human and supporting human-centered design.
Yes.
And I think we need to start looking at things that aren't necessarily measuring up against where does Canada fit in the world, but where do we fit in communities?
So that is a perfect way for us to go to, I don't know if we have enough room for our last question, but it certainly brings us back to our land-based teachings that we mentioned in our early land acknowledgement, and how do we infuse our land acknowledgements into actual policy and honor the land-based teachings of the land we're on. There was a question that came up, and this might be more a question for reflection. What would panelists offer to the Department of Education and Early Childhood as the most urgent, specific action that we would want the commission, when up and running, to hold the department accountable to addressing? So that could be our last conversation, but then we will maybe have to have more conversations and invite the government to meet with us instead of us waiting for that invite.
The first thing that comes to mind, something we were talking about the other day was around graduation completion rate. And although we are, in the high 80s or whatever, that's still 12% of our eligible graduates who are not graduating on time and not completing for a variety of reasons. And we know there's over-representation of people who are not graduating in certain populations. And so we really need to look at how can we challenge moving beyond an individual level to look at what is our population doing in terms of education, because it is such a protective factor for gaining employment, for accessing ways out of poverty and into other supportive elements of society. And so how do we really emphasize and hold the department accountable to be watching that very closely and doing everything possible to help support all of the individuals going through that to graduate and complete a quality education.
I agree. And I think it's not just education and CYC getting together. It's actually looking at the child welfare system as a whole and what they are doing or not doing to support academic attainment. And if there's a disconnect between what we see in the child welfare system and the education system, they need to talk to each other and find a solution, because there's roughly 1,000 kids in the child welfare system in Nova Scotia. And if you look at the math, and less than half of them are going to finish high school, that means very few of them are actually going to get to post-secondary. And we know the implications that education has, as you pointed out, as a buffer for all kinds of other things across the life course. So it's not good enough just to...
Yeah, just something to add from that. One of the participants in my focus group, they brought up, it was a big topic of conversation actually, it was school and the ways that they learn. And one of the conversations we had were about how they feel like the curriculum is built for one type of student. And they feel like they can't learn because there's so many different learning styles. Some say, I'm a better hands-on learner. I'm not even, educated on what's happening in my own community. I don't know about this. I don't know about this. And so one of the conversations they had was, we want to be asked, how do you learn? Like what's the best way? And actually asked with follow-up, not just like, okay, great. Thank you so much for providing that. let's see it actually happen. So that was one of the things, you know, again, going back to the they just want to be heard thing. But, you know, that was one thing, especially within our school systems is, like I said, they spend 5 out of 7 days a week there. And, you know, that is for some, you know, they're saying it's a safe space for them. And so they want to excel in that environment and do well in that environment and have the resources. So how can we provide that for them and meet their needs and hear them at the same time? So just go on that.
I think that's an amazing point, story voice from youth to maybe end on. Thank you all so much for coming. This was such an amazing way to spend a Friday afternoon. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. We hope you all found listening in to us have all these conversations, looking into the fishbowl, as insightful as us here at Dal and the panel. And thanks again to the Healthy Populations Institute, IWK Mental Health and Addictions, and the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. And I just want to put a particular shout out to Kristen Anderson, who this was the brainchild of Schools Plus as a regional manager with Schools Plus down on the Western Shore. And this was her vision and idea, being so tuned in with all of these reports that have been coming out. So that goes to show, you know, the impact that one person's one little idea can have sometime, because here we all are. And so, yeah, have a good weekend, everybody.